She thought she was in control. She thought she could manipulate everyone in the room, including her own son. But little did she know, one unexpected guest was about to turn the entire wedding upside down. You see, some people believe that just because they raised you, they own every major decision in your life. This woman? Oh, she took it to a whole new level. She didn't just want control, she demanded it. But on her son's wedding day, she was about to learn a lesson she'd never forget. Buckle up, because this is the story of how a manipulative mother's plan backfired in the most humiliating way possible. It was a warm Saturday morning in Atlanta, Georgia, the kind of day that felt tailor-made for a wedding. The sky stretched endlessly, a brilliant shade of blue with only a few wispy clouds drifting lazily across the horizon. The sun cast a golden glow over the landscape, illuminating the carefully arranged rows of white chairs on the perfectly manicured lawn of the elegant wedding venue. Guests were arriving in waves, stepping out of polished black town cars and luxury SUVs. Women in pastel-colored dresses clutched small purses and adjusted their wide-brimmed hats, while men in crisp suits chatted in low voices, exchanging pleasantries about the weather, the venue, and, of course, the much-anticipated ceremony. The scent of freshly cut roses and delicate white lilies wafted through the air, blending with the subtle notes of expensive cologne and sweet champagne being poured inside the reception hall. At the heart of it all stood Daniel, the groom. He was 29 years old, tall with an athletic build, dark wavy hair, and the kind of warm brown eyes that made people feel instantly at ease. He had an easygoing nature, a quiet strength about him that made others naturally respect him. But beneath his calm demeanor, there was a tension in his shoulders, a tightness in his jaw, a sign of the silent battle he had fought his entire life. A battle that had always revolved around his mother, Margaret. Margaret was the very definition of overbearing, calculating, and relentless. She was a woman in her late 50s, with immaculately styled ash blonde hair, sharp blue eyes that could pierce through a person's soul, and a presence so commanding that people naturally yielded to her will. Everything about her was precise, from the way she never let a hair fall out of place to how her tailored navy blue dress was flawlessly fitted, exuding an air of power and elegance. To outsiders, Margaret appeared to be the picture of a devoted, sophisticated mother, someone who only wanted the best for her son. But those who knew her well, knew the truth. She wasn't just a controlling mother. She was the controlling mother. From the moment Daniel had taken his first steps, Margaret had been pulling the strings of his life like a master puppeteer. His childhood had been a series of meticulously planned activities, scheduled playdates, and strict academic goals. There was no room for spontaneity, no space for rebellion. She had chosen his extracurriculars, dictated his social circles, and carefully crafted his path to success as if she were designing the blueprint of a flawless son. When Daniel turned 18, he had wanted to study art, a passion that had always burned quietly within him. But Margaret had laughed at the mere suggestion. Art? Daniel, be serious. That's a hobby, not a career. You'll go to law school, just like your father. You'll have stability, respect, and a future. I won't hear another word about it. And just like that, his dream had been erased, replaced with law books and late-night study sessions that never quite felt like they belonged to him. He had gone to the school she chose, taken the job she approved of, lived in the city she preferred. And now, she had her sights set on his wedding. Margaret had never liked Emily, though she had always been careful never to say it outright. Instead, she wielded her disapproval like a finely sharpened knife, cutting subtly but deeply. Emily was kind, intelligent, and had a heart so full of love that it radiated through every interaction she had. She had grown up in a humble, close-knit family, where laughter was abundant, and Sunday dinners were sacred. Unlike Margaret, who valued status, power, and perfection, Emily cherished genuine connection, warmth, and simplicity. From the moment they met, Margaret had made it painfully clear that she did not approve of Emily. She would make small, passive-aggressive comments masked under the guise of politeness. "Oh, Emily, dear, are you sure you don't want to reconsider your dress choice? It's sweet, but perhaps a little simple for such an important occasion. You know, Daniel has always had a certain level of expectation when it comes to home life. I do hope you're up for the challenge. I suppose it's charming how much you and your family enjoy casual gatherings. But in our world, we tend to be a little more refined. And Daniel? He had spent years trying to keep the peace, always caught in the impossible position of pleasing his mother while protecting the woman he loved. Margaret believed Emily wasn't good enough for Daniel. And so, she did what she always did: she plotted. For weeks leading up to the wedding, she had been making small, subtle moves. A comment here, a suggestion there. Placing seeds of doubt in Daniel's mind, trying to make him second-guess his choices. She had insisted on handling the guest list, insisted on helping with the arrangements. "Oh, don't worry, dear. Let me take care of the guest list. After all, you wouldn't want to forget important family members." Daniel, exhausted from months of wedding planning and used to his mother's unyielding persistence, had reluctantly agreed. And Margaret? She had taken full advantage. Because Margaret didn't just want to attend the wedding. She wanted to control it. And if she couldn't control it, she would destroy it. And so, unbeknownst to Daniel or Emily, she had invited people who had no business being there, people she knew would stir the pot, create chaos, and plant just enough doubt to make Daniel question everything. As the wedding guests settled into their seats, as the soft melody of classical music played through the speakers, and as Daniel stood at the altar waiting for his bride, Margaret sat quietly in her chair, a satisfied smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. Because the stage was set. The pieces were in place. And her plan was about to unfold. Little did she know, however, she was about to be the one blindsided. The weeks leading up to the wedding should have been filled with joy and excitement, finalizing the flowers, tasting the cake, choosing the perfect playlist for the first dance. But for Margaret, those weeks were filled with something else. Strategy. Calculation. A carefully orchestrated plan designed to destroy everything. It started subtly. At first, Daniel didn't notice the way his mother lingered near the seating chart longer than necessary, the way she would mention a name he hadn't seen in years and casually ask, "Oh, wouldn't it be lovely to see them again?" He didn't question why she was suddenly so invested in the invitations, offering to handle last-minute RSVPs and make sure everything was in order. He was too distracted by the whirlwind of wedding planning. But Margaret? She was far from distracted. She was focused. She was determined. Because in her mind, this wedding was a mistake, and if Daniel refused to see it, she had no choice but to open his eyes for him. And so, behind closed doors, she started making changes. The secret guest list. Late at night, after Daniel and Emily had finalized their guest list, Margaret sat in her dimly lit home office, her manicured nails clicking against the keyboard as she sent out new invitations. But these weren't the guests Daniel and Emily had chosen. These were her guests. And each one served a specific purpose. White heavy check mark: Emily's ex-boyfriend, Ryan. Ryan wasn't just any ex. He was the ex, the one Emily had dated for years before she met Daniel. Tall, confident, always dressed like he was about to step onto the cover of a fashion magazine. He had been charming, a little too charming, and Margaret knew exactly how to use him. "Oh, Ryan, sweetheart, it's been far too long. I thought it would be wonderful for you to come to the wedding. After all, you and Emily were so close once. It's a shame things didn't work out. But who knows? Maybe seeing her walk down the aisle will bring back some memories." White heavy check mark: a few of Daniel's exes. Margaret wasn't careless with her choices. She didn't invite just any of Daniel's exes. She chose the ones who had unfinished business. Lisa, the one who still sent Daniel messages late at night, always signing off with a miss you. Jessica, the one who never quite accepted their breakup, who had cried for weeks and told anyone who would listen that she and Daniel were meant to be. Oh, darling, I just happened to run into Lisa the other day. She still speaks so highly of you. It would be rude not to invite her. After all, we don't want hurt feelings in a time like this, do we? White heavy check marked the most dramatic, gossipy family members she could find. Every family has them, the instigators, the ones who drink a little too much champagne and whisper behind cupped hands, waiting for the slightest sign of tension so they can turn it into a full-blown disaster. And Margaret knew exactly who to call. Her cousin Linda, who once caused a fight at a baby shower over who got to hold the newborn first. Her sister-in-law Beverly, who had a talent for making passive-aggressive comments sound like compliments. Her old friend Nancy, who thrived on drama like it was oxygen. Oh, Linda, you simply must come to the wedding. It'll be so interesting to see how everything turns out. The goal, total destruction. Margaret wasn't just adding guests. She was adding fuel to a fire she had been waiting to ignite. Her goal wasn't just to make things awkward. It was to make Emily uncomfortable, to make her feel out of place, overwhelmed, suffocated in front of everyone. She wanted Daniel to look around the room, see the chaos unfolding, and question everything. To see Ryan smirking from the front row, Lisa flashing him a knowing smile, Jessica wiping away a fake tear. To hear the whispers, the murmurs. Did you hear? That's Emily's ex. What is he doing here? I heard Daniel's ex still has feelings for him. Wouldn't it be crazy if she objected? This wedding feels off. Something isn't right. She wanted doubt to creep into Daniel's mind like a slow poison, unraveling his confidence in Emily, in the wedding, in everything. And when the moment was right, when the tension was so thick you could slice it with a knife, Margaret would be there, the concerned mother, the voice of reason. Oh, sweetheart, I just don't want you to regret this. Maybe this is a sign that you should take a step back. Her fatal mistake. Margaret sat back in her chair, a satisfied smirk on her face as she clicked send on the final invitation. Her plan was flawless. She would create the chaos. She would control the narrative. She would save Daniel from making the biggest mistake of his life. And the best part? No one would know she was behind it. Or so she thought. Because what Margaret failed to realize was this. The more you try to manipulate people, the more you set yourself up for exposure. And in just a few short days, she was about to experience something she never expected. Her own plan, her own web of lies collapsing around her in the most humiliating way possible. Because someone was watching her. Someone knew exactly what she was up to. And when the wedding day arrived, Margaret wouldn't be the one pulling the strings. She would be the one caught in them. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the elegant outdoor venue. The gentle rustling of leaves from the tall oak trees provided a soothing backdrop to the soft melody of a live string quartet playing in the corner. Rows of white chairs, adorned with delicate lace and fresh white roses, lined the manicured grass, each seat carefully arranged with precision. The air was thick with anticipation. Inside the bridal suite, Emily took a deep breath, staring at herself in the full-length mirror. Her white gown cascaded down in layers of soft tulle, embroidered with tiny pearls that shimmered in the light. A single loose curl framed her face, the rest of her golden brown hair pinned up elegantly. "This is it," she whispered to herself. Meanwhile, at the altar, Daniel stood frozen, his fingers fidgeting with the knot of his tie. His charcoal gray suit was perfectly tailored, his boutonniere pinned with care, but despite his polished appearance, his hands felt clammy, and his heart pounded hard against his ribs. The crowd of guests had settled into their seats, their quiet conversations blending into a soft murmur. Every now and then, Laughter would ripple through the audience as they exchanged excited whispers about the upcoming ceremony. Everything seemed perfect. Until the first unexpected guest arrived. The first disruption, Ryan makes his entrance. The sound of footsteps disrupted the calm atmosphere. Slow, deliberate, and far too confident. Heads turned as a tall man in an expensive navy suit strode into the venue, his polished shoes clicking against the stone pathway. His hair was perfectly styled, his posture too self-assured, and the smirk on his lips was the kind that said, "I know exactly what I'm doing." Emily's ex-boyfriend, Ryan. He walked right past the rows of guests, completely ignoring the polite smiles and nods exchanged among the attendees. Instead, he made a beeline for the front row, choosing the seat directly behind Daniel. He didn't just sit. He settled in, leaning back, stretching his arms over the empty chair next to him as if he were the groom himself. His smirk widened as he casually crossed one leg over the other, exuding a confidence that felt both arrogant and intentional. Daniel's eyebrows furrowed. He turned to his best man, Mark, his voice low but tense. "Who invited him?" Mark blinked in confusion. "Dude, I have no idea." Daniel's stomach twisted. He hadn't spoken to Ryan in years. Emily had made it clear that their relationship was long over, that Ryan was nothing more than a part of her past. So why was he here? And more importantly, who invited him? The second disruption, Lisa arrives. Before Daniel could dwell on Ryan's presence, another shift in the atmosphere drew his attention. There was a stir near the entrance. A few hushed gasps, some not so subtle whispers. Then, Lisa walked in. Lisa, Daniel's ex. And she wasn't just arriving. She was making an entrance. Her dress, a slinky, figure-hugging red gown, was far from appropriate for a wedding. It clung to her curves, the slit riding dangerously high on her thigh as she walked with the deliberate grace of someone who wanted to be noticed. She didn't just walk past Daniel, she slowed down, placing a hand on the back of his chair as she leaned in slightly. "Miss me," she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. Then, with a wink, she slid into a seat near the aisle, crossing her legs in a way that felt entirely too calculated. Daniel felt his stomach drop. This was wrong. This wasn't some coincidental reunion. This was planned. And then, as if on cue, he saw her. The master behind the chaos, Margaret's smug satisfaction. Sitting 3 rows back, Margaret looked like the picture of poised elegance. Her dark blue dress was tailored to perfection, her pearl necklace resting just above the collarbone, her silver hair arranged in a meticulous updo. She sat with an air of quiet satisfaction, her hands delicately folded in her lap. But it was the smirk that gave her away. She wasn't surprised by Ryan's arrival. She wasn't startled by Lisa's entrance. She was expecting this. Daniel knew that look. It was the same expression she had worn when she manipulated him into taking a job he didn't want. It was the same satisfied glint in her eyes when she convinced him to break up with his first real girlfriend. It was the look of a woman who had orchestrated something and was now sitting back to watch it unfold. And suddenly, everything clicked. This wasn't just bad luck. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was his mother's doing. Daniel's jaw clenched, a slow burning anger rising in his chest. She had set this up. She had invited these people, these ghosts of the past, to ruin his wedding. She had done this deliberately, weaving a web of distractions, hoping to shake him, hoping to make him doubt his own choices. For years, he had let her control him, let her opinions dictate his decisions, let her make him question himself. But not today. Not this time. Because what Margaret didn't know, what she could never have predicted, was that this was the day Daniel would finally break free. And she was about to learn that her power over him was about to end. The ceremony had begun. The golden afternoon light filtered through the grand oak trees, casting shimmering patterns on the aisle where Emily stood, a vision of pure elegance. Her dress was breathtaking, a flowing, off-the-shoulder gown with delicate lace embroidery that trailed down to a cathedral-length train. The bodice hugged her slender frame perfectly, accentuating the gracefulness of her every movement. Tiny pearls lined the edges of the fabric, glimmering softly under the gentle sunlight. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her bouquet of white peonies and blush-pink roses, their fragrance mingling with the warm air. As she took her first step down the aisle, a hush fell over the guests. Even the birds seemed to pause, as if nature itself understood the significance of this moment. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. She was perfect. She was his. For a brief moment, all the worries, all the tension melted away. The unwanted guests, his mother's smirk, the strange gnawing feeling in his gut, it all disappeared. Because in that moment, as Emily walked toward him, nothing else mattered. His best man, Mark, nudged him slightly. "Dude, you need to breathe." Daniel let out a shaky exhale, forcing a smile. This is it, he thought. The moment he had waited for his entire life. And then the officiant spoke. "If anyone has any objections, speak now or forever hold your peace." For a second, there was only silence. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, lifting the delicate chiffon of Emily's veil. Daniel could hear the distant chirp of birds, the faint sound of waves crashing from the lake behind them. And then a voice shattered the stillness. "Actually, I do." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Emily froze mid-step. Daniel's eyes widened, his heart hammering against his ribs. Slowly, he turned toward the source of the voice. Lisa. She stood gracefully from her seat, her long red dress clinging to her frame as she flicked her blonde hair over her shoulder. A smug smile played at the edges of her lips. "Daniel, I don't think you really want to do this." Her voice dripped with sickening sweetness, like honey laced with poison. "I mean, we had something special. Are you really sure she's the one?" A stunned silence followed. Eyes darted between Lisa, Emily, and Daniel, guests whispering behind their hands. Emily's face had gone pale, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her bouquet. Daniel clenched his jaw, his blood running cold. And then another voice rang out. "And I agree." The crowd erupted into full-blown murmurs. Daniel turned sharply this time to see Ryan, Emily's ex, standing with an arrogant smirk. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit, casually stepping forward as if he were meant to be part of the ceremony. "Emily," he said smoothly, his voice carrying through the stunned silence, "I know we ended things a while ago, but don't you think we deserve another chance?" Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. "What?" she whispered. Ryan shrugged. "I just think it's a little soon to be making such a big decision. I mean, we had something good, didn't we? Why throw it all away?" Lisa smiled, clearly enjoying the chaos. Margaret, from her seat near the middle, lifted a delicate hand to her mouth, pretending to be shocked, but Daniel saw it. The victorious glint in her eyes. The subtle twitch of her lips. She knew. She had planned this. Daniel felt his stomach churn, his hands curling into fists at his sides. She had orchestrated this entire thing. Emily's ex. His ex. The drama. All of it. Margaret had set this up. The room erupts. The whispers had grown into full-blown murmurs, guests shifting in their seats, stealing glances of disbelief. Some of Emily's relatives were whispering angrily, throwing furious glares at Ryan. Daniel could hear snippets of conversations. Did she really just say that? Why is he here? Oh my God, is this happening right now? Lisa took a step closer to the altar, tilting her head. Daniel, just take a second and think. Her voice was silky smooth, each word deliberately placed like a trap. We were so good together. I never stopped thinking about you. And I don't think you ever really stopped thinking about me either. Emily sucked in a sharp breath, her eyes glossy with anger and hurt. Daniel's hands shook with rage. Ryan took another step toward Emily. "Come on, Em," he said, his voice full of mock sincerity. "Just say the word, and we can walk out of here together. No regrets." Emily finally found her voice. "Are you insane?" she snapped, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. Ryan chuckled, lifting his hands in defense. "Hey, I'm just saying." Daniel had had enough. Daniel takes control. He took a step forward, his voice low and firm. "Lisa." She smirked, tilting her chin up. "Yes, sweetheart." Daniel's eyes darkened. "Get out." Her smile faltered for just a second. "I would." Daniel took another step closer, his voice low but filled with steel. "I don't know what kind of sick game you think you're playing, but I am done. I moved on. And I'm about to marry the love of my life." Lisa's lips parted, shock flashing across her face. "But leave." Daniel's voice was cold, final. Lisa stiffened, then turned on her heel and stormed out humiliated. Daniel then turned to Ryan. Ryan still had his arrogant smirk, but there was uncertainty behind his eyes now. "You too," Daniel growled. Ryan scoffed. "Relax, man. I was just..." Daniel didn't let him finish. "I said leave." Ryan hesitated, then turned and walked away, muttering something under his breath. The moment they disappeared, the room fell into stunned silence. Daniel turned to Emily. Her eyes shimmered a mix of hurt, relief, and love. He gently took her hands. "I choose you," he whispered. "Always." Emily let out a shaky breath, nodding. "I love you." The guests began to clap, the tension melting into something beautiful. But Daniel wasn't done. His gaze snapped toward Margaret. She sat stiffly, her smirk finally gone. Her perfect plan? Destroyed. Her control over him? Gone. And for the first time in his life, Daniel had won. The tension in the room was suffocating. Daniel stood at the altar, his fists clenched, his heart racing. Lisa and Ryan had been escorted out, their attempts to disrupt the ceremony failing spectacularly. But the damage had been done. The guests still whispered among themselves, their eyes flickering between Daniel, Emily, and the woman responsible for all of this, Margaret. She sat unshaken, hands delicately folded in her lap, wearing a mask of feigned innocence. Her smug satisfaction was like a storm cloud hanging over the room, a silent declaration of victory. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully planted doubt in Daniel's mind. She thought she had control. And then, a deep voice cut through the chaos. "Actually, I have something to say, too." The murmur of voices died instantly. The air in the room shifted like a tide suddenly pulling back before a tidal wave. All eyes turned toward the back of the venue. A figure stepped forward. Tall. Broad-shouldered. A strong, imposing presence. The moment Daniel laid eyes on him, his breath caught in his throat. His father. A man he hadn't seen in years. The man Margaret erased. Daniel's father, James Carter, had been a ghost in his life, an image blurred and distorted by years of Margaret's manipulations. She had painted him as irresponsible, reckless, untrustworthy. "Your father? He was a disaster, Daniel. A selfish man who couldn't keep a promise if his life depended on it. I had to be both parents because he refused to be one at all." For years, Daniel had only known one version of the truth, Margaret's version. But now, that version was standing in front of him, alive, real, and holding a phone in his hand. Margaret's smirk vanished. For the first time since the ceremony began, A flicker of panic crossed her perfectly composed face. What are you doing here?" she stammered, the edges of her voice sharper than before. James stepped forward, his boots thudding heavily against the marble floor, each step a statement of defiance. He stopped just a few feet from Margaret, his gaze locked onto hers, unwavering. "Margaret," he said, his voice steady, "do you really think no one knows what you did?" A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. Margaret straightened, her lips pressing together into a thin line. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said coolly. But James only smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Then, with deliberate care, he held up his phone. The screen glowed brightly, illuminating the bold, undeniable truth in the form of text messages. Margaret's text messages. The evidence that changed everything. "I have proof," James continued, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Proof that you invited these people to sabotage your own son's wedding." The room was so silent that even the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside could be heard. Margaret's face drained of color. Daniel stared at the phone, his mind already racing ahead, already piecing together the inevitable truth before he even saw the messages. James handed him the phone. And then, with trembling fingers, Daniel scrolled through the messages. There it was. Clear as day. The texts that exposed Margaret. "Small blue diamond Margaret, Ryan, dear, I think you should come to the wedding. Emily deserves one last chance to reconsider. Small blue diamond Ryan, I don't think that's a good idea. Small blue diamond Margaret, oh, but don't you think it would be interesting? I've arranged for you to be seated near the front. Small blue diamond Margaret, Lisa, darling, Daniel has always had a soft spot for you. Why not remind him of that? Small blue diamond Lisa, I don't know, Margaret. It's his wedding. Small blue diamond Margaret, oh, don't be silly. It's just a little fun. Nothing is set in stone yet. Small blue diamond Margaret to Linda, her gossip-loving cousin, keep your ears open. I have a feeling this wedding won't go as planned." Daniel's hands shook. His throat went dry. Margaret did this. She engineered the chaos. She had invited his exes. She had planted doubt in his mind. She had tried to humiliate Emily. And she sat there through all of it, acting as if she were innocent. Slowly, he lifted his eyes to her. Margaret's lips trembled. "Daniel, sweetheart, you have to understand." "I understand perfectly," Daniel cut in, his voice sharper than steel. "You wanted to ruin my wedding." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Margaret flinched but quickly recovered, her expression twisting into one of desperation. "I was protecting you, Daniel. I did this for you. She's not the right one for you. I just..." Daniel shook his head. For years, he had ignored the truth. For years, he had given her the benefit of the doubt. For years, he had let her dictate his life. But this was the final straw. "Get out." Margaret froze. The guests gasped again, this time, in pure shock. "What?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel's jaw tightened. His voice, calm yet firm, did not waver. "You heard me. You're not welcome here. Get out." Margaret's entire body stiffened, as if the words had physically struck her. "Daniel, I am your mother," she hissed, her voice cracking with anger and disbelief. Daniel met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a calmness she had never seen before. "And this is my life." Margaret gaped, looking around the room as if searching for someone to back her up. But no one did. The guests averted their eyes, some shaking their heads in disapproval. Even her closest friends shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to stand by her now that the truth was out. James, his expression unreadable, stepped aside, giving her a clear path to the exit. For the first time in her life, Margaret was powerless. And she knew it. With a trembling breath, she lifted her chin, trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out. The heavy doors closed behind her with a resounding finality. And just like that, Margaret Carter was gone. Daniel's final moment of freedom. A long silence followed. Then, Emily's hand slipped into Daniel's. He turned to her, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. She smiled, a smile filled with love, understanding, and unwavering support. Daniel took a deep breath. For the first time in his life, he felt free. And as he looked into the eyes of the woman he loved, he knew without a doubt he had made the right choice. Silence. A thick, oppressive silence that weighed heavily over the grand wedding hall. Daniel's fingers trembled as he clenched his fists at his sides, his jaw locked tight. The weight of betrayal settled like a stone in his chest, pressing against his ribs, making it harder to breathe. Margaret stood before him, her face pale, her once perfectly composed features now crumbling under the weight of her exposure. Her pearl necklace, always a symbol of her unshakable poise, sat slightly askew. Her lips, usually painted with soft confidence, now trembled with barely concealed panic. Daniel took a slow, steady breath. Then he spoke. "You did this." His voice was quiet, but beneath it was a restrained fury, one that sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. She licked her lips, her hands twitching at her sides, as if scrambling for a lifeline that simply wasn't there anymore. I was just trying to protect you, honey," she finally burst out, her voice shrill with desperation. "You deserve better than." "No." Daniel's voice cut through her like a blade. Margaret flinched. For the first time, her son, the boy she had spent decades molding, shaping, controlling, was defying her. Daniel's next words came slow and measured, but every syllable carried the weight of years of suppressed resentment finally breaking free. "What I deserve," he said, "is a mother who supports me." The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Margaret's breath hitched. Daniel's eyes bore into her, unwavering, stronger than she had ever seen them before. "What I don't deserve," he continued, "is a manipulative, controlling woman who thinks she owns my life." A shocked gasp swept through the crowd. Margaret took a stumbling step back, as if physically struck by his words. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her dress, clutching it tightly, as though grasping onto the last remnants of her control. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had orchestrated everything. She had planned every detail, every manipulation, every distraction. And yet, her son was choosing someone else, defying her. Margaret's eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, for someone to defend her, to justify her actions. But she found nothing. The guests had turned away. Her so-called friends avoided her gaze. Even the officiant stood frozen, looking as though he had witnessed something far greater than just a family dispute. She was alone. And for the first time in her life, she knew it. The choice that changed everything. Daniel turned away from Margaret. He no longer cared what she thought. Her influence, her manipulations, they had no power over him anymore. He turned to Emily. Her eyes shimmered, filled with a mix of uncertainty and unwavering love. For a brief moment, Daniel felt a pang of guilt. His mother's schemes had nearly ruined this day, their day. But then he saw it. Emily's fingers, clutching her bouquet so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her shoulders, tensed with the weight of humiliation she didn't deserve. Her lips, pressed into a thin, trembling line, as though she were bracing herself for the worst. She thought he might walk away. The realization hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. She thought he might let his mother win. That was all he needed. With a warm, reassuring smile, Daniel reached forward, taking Emily's hands gently in his own. Her breath hitched at the touch. Then, he spoke the words that shattered every one of his mother's twisted plans. "Let's get married." Emily's eyes widened. Her lips parted in shock, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had just heard. For a second, the entire world held its breath. Then, her face broke into a brilliant, tearful smile. Daniel felt his heart swell with something fierce and unbreakable. The guests, who had been holding onto their collective shock, burst into applause. Margaret loses everything. Margaret's legs buckled, her entire world crumbling before her eyes. This was supposed to be her victory. She had spent months weaving her web, setting up every single piece for Daniel to fail. But in the end, he had chosen Emily. He had chosen love. He had chosen himself. Margaret stumbled back further, eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. Her perfect world, unraveling right in front of her. And then, before she could even think of another move, 2 security guards stepped forward. They were silent, their expressions unreadable. Margaret's lips parted. "You wouldn't dare." But Daniel didn't even look at her. "Escort her out." The words were final. Margaret gasped, rage flickering behind her eyes. "I am your mother," she shrieked, her voice bordering on hysterical. Daniel didn't flinch. For the first time, her words held no power over him. The guards stepped closer. Margaret, realizing her final defeat, let out a trembling breath. With the last shreds of her dignity, she lifted her chin, her lips pressing into a thin, furious line. Then, with one final glance toward her son, a look that burned with bitterness and betrayal, she turned. The heavy doors creaked open, revealing the blinding light of the afternoon sun. Margaret stepped out. The doors slammed shut behind her. And just like that, she was gone. A love that couldn't be broken. Daniel turned back to Emily. The officiant, still visibly shaken, cleared his throat. "Shall we continue?" Daniel let out a deep breath. Then, he grinned. "Yes." Emily laughed through her tears, nodding. "Yes." The officiant picked up where he left off, but this time, there were no more interruptions. No distractions. No doubts. Just Daniel and Emily, standing before each other, ready to begin the rest of their lives. As they exchanged vows, Daniel felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. Freedom. And above all else, love. Because in the end, Margaret's manipulations didn't win. Love did. And just like that, Margaret lost everything. She tried to manipulate her son, but in the end, her own actions exposed her. So, what do you think? Was Daniel right to cut off his mother? Have you ever dealt with someone this manipulative? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to The Unravel for more crazy real-life stories.